Daniel's laughter filled the room as I announced my intention to file for divorce. I stood motionless, maintaining a steady gaze while he dismissed my declaration. Our discussion had centered around his family's upcoming charity gala, with particular emphasis on my expected appearance and behavior as the wife of a prominent surgeon. Melissa, his office manager, nodded along to every word from behind her tablet. 3 weeks after consulting a lawyer, my phone buzzed repeatedly with Daniel's name on the screen. Upon answering, his voice sounded panicked. "What have you done?" I couldn't help but smile at the irony of his question. I introduced myself calmly as Catherine Williams, a 34-year-old art curator who had put my promising gallery career on hold 7 years ago to support my husband's medical practice and social obligations. I explained how I had organized and hosted countless fundraisers and dinner parties, particularly focused on connecting wealthy donors with medical causes. I managed our social calendar with precision, a role that had grown increasingly demanding despite Daniel's minimal appreciation. Despite the challenges, showing weakness wasn't an option. These social connections had become my entire identity, and preserving my dignity fueled my determination. Today, sitting in my new apartment surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, the weight of Daniel's betrayal hung heavily in my mind. Daniel, my husband of 7 years, had drastically changed his behavior about 8 months ago when Melissa joined his practice as office manager. His once appreciative demeanor transformed into constant criticism of my appearance, my conversational skills, and my lack of ambition, making every social event an exercise in humiliation. Even when I secured major donors for his pet projects, he remained dismissive, instructing me to observe how Melissa handles professional interactions and warning me against embarrassing him with my outdated perspectives. Melissa eagerly joined in the undermining, scheduling over my carefully planned events and mocking my traditional role as a doctor's wife despite having divorced 2 surgeons already, a fact apparently unknown to Daniel. I remained determined to maintain our social standing regardless of their behavior. Their disparagement intensified with Daniel accusing me of being financially dependent, branding my contributions to our life as worthless. Melissa echoed his sentiments, sighing dramatically while suggesting I was lucky Daniel was generous enough to maintain my lifestyle. The latest insult came when Daniel unexpectedly handed me a stack of invitations to his hospital's annual fundraising gala, demanding they be personally addressed and delivered to every board member and major donor within 3 days. After handing me the list, I stared in disbelief. "This gala is this weekend. Why am I just getting these now?" I questioned, confused by the impossible timeline. Before I could fully comprehend the situation, Daniel was already adjusting his tie in the mirror, completely disinterested in addressing my concerns. "Melissa normally handles this, but she's busy with more important matters. Just get it done," he remarked casually as he quickly left our home for an emergency consultation, leaving me with an impossible task designed for failure. Melissa texted shortly after. "Daniel mentioned you needed something simple to keep you occupied. Don't worry if it's too challenging for you." The absurdity of the situation dawned on me as I examined the invitation list more carefully. To my surprise, many names were people I had personally introduced to Daniel, including several of my former gallery clients. The realization deepened my suspicions about why Daniel had been systematically belittling me. He and Melissa were gradually erasing my contributions while preparing to remove me from his life entirely. My extensive social connections and deeper relationships with key donors made me invaluable to Daniel's professional advancement. Daniel's increasingly cold demeanor and obvious preference for Melissa at social functions created uncomfortable moments whenever the 3 of us were present at events. It seemed Melissa's rapid rise within his professional and personal life was strategic, driven by ambition rather than competence. The painful truth settled in my stomach like a stone. Their affair had likely been ongoing for months, explaining Daniel's late nights and sudden weekend conferences. Melissa's antagonism wasn't merely professional jealousy. She was methodically replacing me in every aspect of my life. Despite these betrayals, I needed to navigate the impending gala while formulating my exit strategy. It seemed my role as the perfect doctor's wife was far from over, but perhaps the script could be rewritten. Then, unexpectedly, I received a call from Eleanor Blackwell, the elderly widow of a pharmaceutical magnate and the hospital's most generous donor. Our company had recently benefited enormously from her 8-figure donation following my careful cultivation of her trust over numerous lunches and gallery tours. The hospital board had publicly credited Daniel with securing this relationship, though it was entirely my connection. Eleanor requested I join her for tea the following afternoon, an invitation impossible to decline. Entering Eleanor's impressive estate, I noticed Daniel's luxury sedan already parked outside. In her formal sitting room, Daniel and Melissa were seated across from Eleanor, all wearing expressions of barely concealed tension. Eleanor wasted no time with pleasantries. "Catherine, darling, Daniel tells me you're stepping back from your charitable work. Is this true?" My mind raced as I processed this unexpected information. Daniel and Melissa had apparently informed Eleanor that I was voluntarily reducing my involvement, citing personal issues, while assuring her that Melissa would seamlessly continue managing donor relations. Eleanor, who had specifically developed her relationship with the hospital through me, seemed concerned about this sudden change. The reality hit me. They were preemptively removing me from relationships I had personally cultivated, likely preparing for the divorce Daniel didn't yet know I was planning. However, confirming this fabrication would risk portraying me as unstable and unreliable to a woman whose opinion mattered greatly in our social circle. I carefully presented the situation. "Eleanor, there seems to be some confusion. While I'm reassessing certain aspects of my life, my commitment to causes I believe in remains unchanged." Eleanor studied me thoughtfully before turning to Daniel with evident skepticism. "Then why would Daniel suggest you were experiencing difficulties requiring a complete withdrawal from the foundation board?" Daniel, visibly uncomfortable, interrupted. "Catherine has been struggling with the pressures of our social obligations recently. We thought a break might help her regain perspective." Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on me. "Is that accurate, Catherine?" The moment of reckoning had arrived. Despite my anger and hurt, maintaining my dignity remained paramount. "The truth, Eleanor, is that Daniel and I are experiencing some personal challenges. However, my dedication to the hospital foundation is independent of those matters." I paused, considering my next words carefully. "In fact, I've been developing some new fundraising concepts I'd be delighted to discuss with you privately." Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression softening as she assessed the situation. "I would prefer that, dear. After all, it was your insight into art therapy programs that initially captured my interest." Daniel paled noticeably while Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "That won't be necessary," Daniel quickly interjected. "Catherine will be quite busy in the coming months with personal matters." The implied suggestion of my imminent removal from our social circle hung heavily in the air. Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "I believe Catherine can determine her own schedule, Daniel, and I've always found her particularly adept at balancing multiple priorities." The meeting concluded with Eleanor requesting a private lunch with me the following week, effectively excluding Daniel and Melissa from the conversation. As we departed the estate, Daniel gripped my arm tightly, hissing, "What game are you playing?" "We agreed you'd step back from hospital matters." I gently removed his hand, responding, "No, Daniel, you decided that. I never agreed to abandon relationships I've spent years cultivating." Melissa interjected, "You're being difficult. Daniel and I have plans that don't include your continued involvement." The naked truth finally emerged. They wanted me gone from both Daniel's personal life and his professional network, but needed a controlled exit to maintain appearances. I made a decision in that moment, stating calmly, "I'll attend the gala this weekend as expected. After that, we should discuss our future arrangements properly, with full financial disclosure." Daniel's face contorted with frustration, but with Eleanor's continued support hanging in the balance, he reluctantly agreed. The following days were filled with tense silence as I prepared for the gala, selecting a new dress that departed from my usual conservative style. When the evening arrived, I entered the hospital ballroom independently, having declined Daniel's offer to drive together. The subtle murmurs and glances as I navigated the crowd confirmed my suspicions. Rumors about our marriage had already begun circulating. Daniel appeared momentarily stunned by my confident entrance before quickly composing himself and approaching with Melissa close behind. "You're late," he whispered sharply. "And that dress is hardly appropriate." I smiled politely, responding just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I thought it was time for a change, darling. Melissa's influence on our lives has been so transformative lately." Throughout the evening, I moved purposefully through the crowd, personally connecting with each board member and major donor. Years of observing these social dynamics had taught me exactly how to navigate these waters. When the time came for Daniel's speech, I positioned myself strategically near Eleanor and the board chairman. Daniel spoke eloquently about dedication and partnership, thanking Melissa specifically for her invaluable contributions while barely acknowledging my presence. As polite applause followed his remarks, Eleanor leaned toward me. "Interesting speech. He seems to have forgotten who introduced him to half the people in this room." The chairman nodded in agreement, adding quietly, "Including me. Catherine, we've missed your input at the last few committee meetings." I smiled graciously, explaining that I hadn't received the recent meeting invitations, a revelation that caused the chairman's eyebrows to rise significantly. The evening continued with Daniel growing increasingly agitated as he observed my easy rapport with the hospital's most influential supporters. Melissa attempted to insert herself into several conversations only to find herself politely but firmly excluded by donors who preferred my familiar presence. As the event concluded, Eleanor took my hand warmly, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard. "My dear, regardless of what happens with your personal situation, your position on my foundation board remains secure. In fact, I'd like to discuss increasing your role." The message was clear to anyone listening. My social capital was independent of my marriage to Daniel. The drive home was silent, tension radiating from Daniel until we entered our house. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded once the door closed behind us. "Those are my professional relationships." I removed my earrings calmly, responding, "No, Daniel. Those are relationships I cultivated that you've benefited from. There's a significant difference." His face flushed with anger. "You're my wife. Everything you do reflects on me." The moment had arrived. "Actually, about that, I've consulted a lawyer. I'll be filing for divorce next week." Daniel's expression transformed from anger to shock, then calculation. "Don't be ridiculous. You have nothing without me. Where will you go? How will you support yourself?" His dismissive tone confirmed everything I needed to know about his regard for me. I accepted a position as curator at the Westfield Gallery last month. Eleanor's recommendation was quite helpful. The revelation landed like a physical blow. "You've been planning this? While living in my house? Spending my money?" I laughed softly at his assumption. "Daniel, I've maintained my own savings from my gallery sales before we married. And according to our prenuptial agreement, I'm entitled to half the value of our home, the home I decorated, maintained, and used to host the dinners that built your career." Daniel's face paled as realization dawned. "You wouldn't damage my reputation. Think of what people would say." "People already talk, Daniel. Melissa has made sure of that with her indiscretion. The question is what they'll say when they learn the full story." The mention of Melissa's name triggered visible panic. "This is about Melissa? She's just my office manager." I sighed, retrieving my phone and opening the folder of photographs sent by the private investigator I'd hired months ago. Office managers don't typically accompany their employers to weekend getaways in wine country, or share hotel rooms on conference trips. Daniel stared at the evidence in stunned silence. 2 months later, I settled into my new apartment, considerably smaller than our marital home but entirely mine. The divorce proceedings had been mercifully quick once Daniel realized I had documented not only his affair but also several financial discrepancies in his practice that would interest the medical board. Eleanor had been true to her word, installing me as the artistic director of her family foundation with a generous salary and flexible schedule that allowed me to resume my curatorial work. The hospital board, concerned about retaining donor relationships, had quietly removed Daniel from fundraising responsibilities while maintaining his surgical privileges. I learned about the aftermath through mutual acquaintances. Daniel and Melissa's relationship had imploded spectacularly once they realized that much of the social capital they'd taken for granted had actually been mine. Melissa, recognizing the sinking ship, had quickly secured a position at a competing hospital, leaving Daniel professionally isolated. Without my social connections maintaining their goodwill, several board members began closely scrutinizing Daniel's departmental expenses and surgical outcomes. Daniel occasionally called, his tone alternating between conciliatory and accusatory. "You've destroyed everything I built," he claimed during our last conversation. I reminded him gently, "We built it together, Daniel. You just failed to recognize the value of my contribution until it was gone." Melissa, I heard, had already moved on to a promising relationship with a younger doctor at her new hospital. The pattern seemed destined to repeat itself, though I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge, only relief that I was no longer part of the cycle. As for me, I embrace my professional renaissance with unexpected joy. My curatorial eye, once directed toward creating the perfect backdrop for Daniel's ambitions, now focused on emerging artists and therapeutic art programs funded by Eleanor's foundation. My social calendar remained full, though now populated by events I chose because they interested me rather than benefited my spouse. Many of our former friends had quietly shifted their allegiance, maintaining their connections with me while finding reasons to miss Daniel's increasingly rare social gatherings. Eleanor, who had become something of a mentor, remarked during one of our regular lunches, "You know, my dear, Howard was much like your Daniel in our early years, convinced that his success was entirely self-made. It took losing an important hospital contract for him to recognize the value of my social intelligence. Daniel, unfortunately, had to lose you entirely to learn the same lesson." I smiled at the comparison, but shook my head slightly. "I think the difference is that Howard was wise enough to learn from the experience." Eleanor laughed knowingly, raising her glass in a toast, to wisdom learned, whether early or late. In my new life, I discovered something unexpected, genuine happiness independent of my role as someone's wife. The apartment I decorated reflected my artistic sensibilities without compromise. The events I attended served my interests and ambitions rather than someone else's. Even my wardrobe transformed, shedding the conservative doctor's wife aesthetic for pieces that expressed my personality and creativity. 6 months after the divorce, I attended the hospital's annual gala again, this time as Eleanor's guest of honor, recognized for establishing an art therapy program for pediatric patients. Daniel was present, standing alone near the bar while I moved easily through the crowd of familiar faces. Our eyes met briefly across the room, and I acknowledged him with a simple nod before turning back to my conversation with the hospital's new chief of surgery. In that moment, I realized the final truth of our marriage. What Daniel had perceived as dependency had actually been choice. I had chosen to support his career and ambitions, but that choice had never defined my capabilities, only my priorities. Now my priorities had changed, and with them, my entire world had transformed. My second chapter had just begun, and for the first time in years, I was the author of my own story.